Across the Fence. I'm Jolie Whitney. Today we're talking about a difficult and perhaps misread or better misheard topic, freedom of speech. First, a quick civics lesson. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievance." Within those 45 words, there is a lot of nuance and plenty of room for interpretation, such as where does free speech end and hate speech begin? What constitutes censorship, and how can people maintain a free and open dialogue in order to counter hate and disinformation? Our guest today is Nadine Strossen. Among her many accolades, she served as the 6th president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 until 2008, becoming the first woman to hold that position. In 1995, she published her first book, Defending Pornography, Free Speech, Sex, and the Fight for Women's Rights. She also published Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech, Not Censorship, and most recently, Free Speech, What Everyone Needs to Know. She teaches at New York Law School, and last but not least, she's here in Vermont to deliver this year's Aiken Lecture at the University of Vermont. Welcome.
I'm so happy to be here, Julie.
And we're very happy to have you. First, let's start with kind of brass tacks. Can you define hate speech?
Hate speech is not legally defined for the precise reason that the U.S. Supreme Court has never recognized a category of speech that is unprotected based on its hateful content. We tend to use the word hate speech in everyday speech to refer to expression that conveys hateful or discriminatory ideas, but the U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly refused, including very recently, to say that a hateful message alone is enough to justify suppressing the speech.
So let's dive into kind of one form of hate speech. You yourself are actually the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, but you would defend maybe the speech of a neo-Nazi or a racist. Why is that?
Yeah, well, let me again stress, Jolie, that the content, the hateful message alone is not enough to justify suppressing it. If, however, in a particular context, the hateful message directly causes certain specific harm or imminently threatens certain specific harm, then it can and should be punished. So if a hateful message is shouted directly in the face of a targeted individual, it may very well be punishable as so-called fighting words or harassment or bullying. It could constitute what the Supreme Court calls a true threat if it instills a reasonable fear that you're going to be subject to attack. So most personally directed hateful speech is in fact sensibly already outlawed under the First Amendment, but solely to express an idea that is considered hateful is not enough to suppress it, because in our free society, it is not for the government to make those determinations. It is for we, the people. And the concept of hate is so subjective. One person's hateful speech is somebody else's cherished idea. And let me give you a very good, well, I'll give you one historical example and one current example. So throughout history, every movement that has challenged the existing power structures and sought to advance human rights for groups that were traditionally marginalized or oppressed has been attacked as engaging in hate speech. I know it sounds ridiculous to us today, but abolitionist speech against slavery was considered hate speech against the status quo and against the so-called slave owners. More recently, Black Lives Matter rhetoric, which many people see as the opposite of hate speech, has been attacked by many powerful officials as hate speech against white people, hate speech against police officers. Same way, the phrase Blue Lives Matter has been attacked as hate speech against black people. So it's so dangerous to give the government that subjective power to make those determinations about ideas. And if you look at the course of history in the United States, we really have come a long way toward countering discriminatory and hateful ideas and policies, not through censorship, but through the exercise of free speech. Martin Luther King was such a champion and exponent, an exerciser of free speech, and one of his statements in a documentary film that is going to be aired in conjunction with my presentation on campus, he said, "The greatness of America is the right to protest for rights.
Absolutely. And now let's dive into actually one of your first works. In your first book, you defend pornography. And what free speech argument did you make there, and how did you correlate that to women's rights?
And I should say, you know, publishers love to have provocative titles. That title is not quite an accurate description of my position, because I defend not the message itself, whether it's hate speech or disinformation or pornography or any controversial speech. I'm not saying I don't endorse it, but what I do support neutrally is freedom of speech. And that entails not only the right of people to convey information and ideas, but also the right of people to receive it. The term pornography, like the term hate speech, is not a legal term of art. And people tend to use it in a stigmatizing fashion for whatever sexually oriented or sexually themed expression they consider offensive. So in recent years, to this day, we see many state legislatures and local government bodies using the P word to disparage any books that are written by or about LGBTQ themes, and removing those books, or trying to remove those books from public libraries, from school libraries, and from curricula. And that epithet has been targeted at even classic works of literature if they happen to have any sexually explicit passage.
And in the world of social media, has been protecting free speech and avoiding censorship, has that become more difficult?
It has, in the sense that it's such an easy political target for both Democrats and Republicans to attack tech titans who are quite unpopular and seeking to rein in their so-called content moderation policy and power. And the only thing that is agreed upon, I think, by the two major presidential candidates is that we should government should restrict the power of social media companies, but they radically disagree about how, which again shows how completely subjective it is to determine that some speech is so harmful that we, the American people, have to be protected against it. And I'm putting that in quotes because that kind of paternalism is really inconsistent with the whole spirit of liberty, equality, and democracy that animate our country.
And do you think censorship online is different from censorship that we've seen before in more conventional media, or is it all the same?
It's all the same. You know, throughout history, every time a new medium of communication has been invented, those of us who support free speech and human rights and equality and dignity get very excited because it becomes a powerful tool to organize and advocate and communicate for our causes. But those who have a more authoritarian, or let's say communitarian bent, are always fearful about the dangerous potential. A medium of communication is just that. It's a neutral conduit or channel which will transmit whatever we individual human beings choose to transmit. And we can raise our voices for enormous positive purposes as well as negative. The negative tends to get more publicity, and I certainly defend freedom of the press, including, you know, which you're exercising very influentially. But we know the old cliche, if it bleeds, it leads. So you have the existing media giving disproportionate attention, I think, to the negative uses of social media and other online technology, and taking for granted the huge positive that has resulted from it, really empowering virtually everybody on this planet to communicate with everybody else on this planet.
And now let's talk about, you mentioned the media a little bit, and let's talk about a story that's filled the headlines recently. The most recent free speech controversy has been around anti-Semitic speech and speech advocating terrorism in the wake of the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel and kind of everything that's followed that. So what is the line between protecting punishable speech in this instance?
Yes, so this is a really good illustration of what I said earlier, Jolie. The fact that people are making anti-Semitic statements or pro-genocide statements or anti-Palestinian statements, choose whatever you consider to be the most evil or dangerous message. The message alone is not going to justify restriction. But if that same message is directly targeted at a particular individual or small group of individuals, and let's say, you know, their students, as has been reported, are followed around campus with targeted condemnatory or discriminatory messages, that may well constitute punishable harassment or intimidation or discriminatory harassment or even threats. Another way in which expression on campus runs afoul of protected free speech is if it violates reasonable content-neutral time, place, and manner restrictions by interfering with the primary purpose of the university, which is education. So if students are camped out or just having a daylight protest in a crowded area of campus where they're making so much noise that it's impossible or difficult to hear what's going on in a lecture hall, or it's difficult to gain access to a lecture hall. It doesn't matter what their message is. They can and should be even-handedly punished because they are undermining, interfering with the prime purpose of the university. Now, it is true that the university must provide ample, I'm quoting a legal phrase here, ample alternative channels for the demonstrators. There has to be some time, some place, some manner in which they are allowed to convey their protest messages.
And we actually only have about a minute left, but before we wrap up, I want to kind of maybe do a call to action. What can we do? This has been a pretty contentious election season, and what can we do as just people to help make sure we stay civil in conversations?
Well, exactly what has been happening throughout my wonderful visit to Burlington, which is people wanting to learn more about free speech rights and wrongs, wanting to understand when they can raise their voices, including to raise their voices in defense of free speech, which means making sure that speech that is constitutionally protected is not restricted, but also making sure that expression that crosses the line, that is harassment or intimidation, or does disrupt the educational process, that is restricted because that interferes with other people's freedom of speech. So in a word, education, empowerment, information, and in that spirit, thank you so much for providing exactly all of those really important services.
And we're absolutely happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Jolie.
And that takes care of Across the Fence for today. My thanks to the crew behind the scenes here who make our program possible. I'm Jolie Whitney. Have a good one.